In this video, we'll look at the Compromise of 1877, which revolved around the 1876 election and the end of Reconstruction. As the election of 1876 approached, most of the South had, in the Southern view, been redeemed. Federal troops remained in three Southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Now, in the other states, redeemers were beginning to crack down on African Americans. The country remained in economic distress following the Panic of 1873, and voters remained concerned about corruption in government. The frontrunner for the Republican nomination was Speaker of the House James G. Blaine. You can see him on the right here. Blaine, however, had been linked to some questionable railroad dealings, and given the public opinion, the concern for corruption, the Republicans decided against the nomination. The Republicans instead nominated the former Civil War officer and three-term governor of Ohio, Rutherford B Hayes. Hayes was campaigning against corruption and for civil service reform, and he's also advocate of hard money, of a tight monetary system. He didn't really stress changing policies about Reconstruction in the South because everybody was tired of it. The Democratic nomination went on the second ballot to Samuel J. Tilton, who was a millionaire corporation lawyer and a former governor of New York. As governor of New York, he too had been fighting against corruption, and he too, they were not going to stress the situation in the South. People were just exhausted of it. The election was the campaign anyway. There weren't any really burning issues. They agreed on corruption. Neither one of them was planning to crack down on the injustices that were growing with the redemption of the South. And all the Republicans were left doing is once again waving the bloody shirt. And the Democrats were, of course, pointing to Republican corruption. And it just wasn't a very pretty election. When the votes were tabulated, the early reports seemed to suggest that the Democrat Tilton had won, but Republicans were claiming that there were voting irregularities and corruption in many of these states, especially in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, the states where troops remained. They're going to concede in Florida, but that the Republicans won, but they're going to fight in South Carolina and Louisiana, where they said because the troops are there, it wasn't really representative of the true public opinion. Well, neither one of them had enough of the requisite electoral college votes to carry the day, and so technically it would go to the Congress, but the Congress remained, the Congress probably couldn't solve the problem. The House was controlled by the Democrats, and the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, and if they voted, it'd probably be gridlock still. And so what they decided to do was they decided to push a 15-member electoral commission, and there'd be 5 members from the House, 5 members from the Senate, and 5 members from the Supreme Court. And the informal thought was that there'd be 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Of course, that left a lot of jockeying for that last position. As this unfolded, leading Republicans, by the way, including James A. Garfield, who would later become President of the United States, and leading Democrats met at the Wormley House off Lafayette Park, right adjacent to the White House. You can see it left. There they had informal discussions, and they ended up reaching an agreement. And that agreement is going to be accepted by the commission, and it's going to term the commission's membership and the ultimate result of the election of 1876. This agreement and the commission's adoption of it became known as the Compromise of 1877. The Democrats in the Compromise of 1877 let the disputed states of South Carolina and Louisiana go Republican. They conceded that. But in exchange for that, the Republicans agreed that they would pull out the remaining troops in these states. And they would also promise some additional money for things like Mississippi levees and other internal improvements in the South. So with this agreement, the commission adopted it, and Rutherford B Hayes won the election. Here you can see some cartoons depicting the Compromise of 1877. On the left, you see Rutherford B Hayes riding the Electoral Commission, it says on the donkey. Of course, the donkey had become representative was becoming representative of the Democratic Party, so he's riding those Democrats on the commission that gave in and getting past Tilton. On the other cartoon, you can see Tilton crying because Rutherford B Hayes has taken the play pony. Here's Rutherford B Hayes' inauguration in 1877, and Hayes, according to the agreement, withdrew the troops from the South Carolina and Louisiana, the last federal troops, and that ended Reconstruction, leaving the South, in the Southern view, redeemed. Historians have debated the relative success of the Reconstruction era of 1865 through 1877 ever since it ended. Certainly with the redemption of the South, the United States missed an opportunity to ensure economic and social equality of African Americans. During the debate over Reconstruction in the Congress, many radical Republicans and others had proposed a legislation that would have broken up the southern landed estates and given each freedman 40 acres and a mule. The idea being if they had land and they had a beast of burden to farm and plow that land, they would be able to produce their own money and be truly independent, which would lead to equality. Unfortunately, in retrospect, that didn't happen. And thus the freedmen were freed, but they didn't have any education other than the freedmen's schools and what they could get from that, and they didn't have any land or anything of value. Now, the former Southerners, the Confederacy, the big plantation owners, they still owned their land, but they no longer had slaves. Now, let's put these two together. The big slave owners needed labor. And the freedmen, all they had was their manual agricultural labor. And so what resulted was the infamous system of sharecropping in the Reconstruction era South. What happened was these landed owners, the ex-slave owners, would allow the slaves to farm their land in exchange for rent. Now, of course, what they ended up doing was allowing the rent in a percentage of the crops they grew, and they set that rental rate so high that any crops that the freedman's family didn't eat, there wasn't enough to sell at market, and thus these freedmen could not really accumulate capital to in the future buy their own land or buy much at all for themselves. They were stuck on the same land, often working for the same man as they'd been enslaved before. Here's a picture of a sharecropping family, and some of them were even in the same slave shacks they'd been in before. And again, there's no way to accumulate capital, no way to escape, and it assures inequality for postbellum African Americans in the South. I've already talked about the redemption of the South, and the Southerners were back in charge when the last federal troops were withdrawn in the Compromise of 1877 and Reconstruction was over with. Well, the Southerners, what they ended up adopting was a system of segregation laws, and these collectively become known as Jim Crow laws, and they're mentioned in a subsequent video. But what they did effectively was keep African Americans from voting and enforce a segregation that, of course, was unequal. And it's difficult to say that Reconstruction was successful in this sense that there was any type of equality, because there wasn't. There were black and white separation and everything. In the South, the racist status quo remained in force until the so-called Second Reconstruction, and that was, of course, the civil rights protests of the 1950s and 1960s, which I discuss in other videos. But while decrying the inequities and the horrible failures of Reconstruction, I'd be remiss if I didn't, include the fact that, hey, in one generation they ended slavery, and they did lay the legal foundations for the Second Reconstruction, the foundations for the ideals that the United States professed to uphold. Very quickly, in a span of only 10, 15 years, what they'd adopted was the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which made anyone born in the United States a citizen and would not allow any governments to deprive those citizens of their constitutional rights, and the 15th Amendment, which explicitly, unambiguously gave African Americans the right to vote. In the era of Reconstruction, some African Americans have been elected to political office, at least while their troops were still there, and they performed admirably. There were new state constitutions passed, new local and state legislation, and yeah, I know that all of these things were ignored by the Redeemers once the federal troops were out. But the legal foundation was there. And of course, it's the legal foundation that people like Martin Luther King build off of with the Second Reconstruction. So you can't really say the Reconstruction era was a complete loss. Obviously, these are hugely important amendments, and it puts an end to Reconstruction, but it did not completely abandon the African Americans. This concludes the video on the end of Reconstruction and the Compromise of 1877.